In October 1519, thousands of unarmed Caulilan nobles, merchants, and high priests stand completely enclosed within the towering stone walls of the sacred temple courtyard. They gather tightly under the explicit promise of a peaceful diplomatic parley, bringing only offerings of maize, roasted fowl, and copal incense. The massive heavy wooden gates suddenly slam shut. The metallic clank of steel locks and iron bars sealing the exits echoes through the momentary dead silence. Ironclad foreign mercenaries position themselves blocking every possible escape route, gripping heavy matchlock firearms and razor-sharp Toledo steel swords. From the elevated stone terraces, armored crossbowmen deliberately level their sights at the dense, trapped crowd below. The commander's signal drops. Deafening volleys of lead balls tear through unprotected human flesh at point-blank range. Thick Gragan smoke instantly chokes the stagnant air, completely masking the frantic, deafening screams of the dying. Heavy armored cavalry brutally charges directly into the confined, tightly packed space. Massive iron-shod hooves physically crush human skulls and violently shatter spines. Razor-sharp cavalry lances impale multiple bodies simultaneously, pinning twitching victims to the sun-baked earth. Panicked, screaming crowds blindly trample their own elders and children, desperately trying to scale the sheer, vertical stone walls with bare, bloody hands. Spanish infantrymen relentlessly advance in tight, disciplined formations, methodically thrusting 3-foot steel blades into chests, stomachs, and throats, never once breaking their rigid ranks. Human blood pools so deep it floods over the intricately carved stone steps, flowing heavily into the surrounding streets in thick, viscous crimson rivers. The mechanized slaughter continues for 2 uninterrupted hours of sheer agony. The killers systematically butcher over 3,000 entirely defenseless people. They meticulously set fire to the central towering temples, intentionally burning the remaining desperate survivors alive inside the enclosed sanctuaries while they scream for their silent gods. The heavy, nauseating scent of roasted human flesh, voided bowels, and sulfur saturates the entire enclosed valley. This is the strictly calculated application of absolute, paralyzing terror. The sole architect of this unprecedented massacre stands motionlessly in the central plaza, watching the systematic extermination with cold, calculated, clinical detachment. He explicitly refuses to halt the killing until his specific psychological objective is definitively achieved. He deliberately leaves the thousands of rotting corpses exactly where they violently fell, feeding the local vultures and starving stray dogs. He orders the severed, bloody heads continuously displayed along the main trade causeway. This horrific theater of unrestrained violence is a heavily deliberate message broadcasted to the massive, heavily armed Aztec Empire sitting waiting across the distant mountains. The invading commander ruthlessly ensures every surrounding tributary tribe inherently understands one absolute, terrifying truth: any resistance guarantees total, merciless annihilation. The unprovoked slaughter is absolutely not a spontaneous loss of discipline or control. It is a highly precise military strategy clinically engineered to mentally break an entire sophisticated civilization before a single formal, organized military battle is actually fought. Every brutal stab wound, every deliberately burned temple, every festering rotting corpse directly serves the singular, twisted purpose of complete psychological domination. He completely weaponizes human fear, turning the horrific, traumatized accounts of the few bleeding survivors into his absolute greatest psychological and military asset. The arid, unforgiving dirt of Extremadura breeds a specific class of ruthless predators. Generations of minor nobility inherit nothing but rusted swords, rigid family crests, and overwhelming debts. The rigid Spanish social hierarchy strictly forbids these men from performing manual labor or engaging in common trade. The singular available path to escape absolute poverty requires extreme violence executed in the name of the crown. The grueling 700-year holy war of the Reconquista hardwires an aggressive, uncompromising religious fanaticism directly into the cultural DNA of these impoverished aristocrats. They firmly believe military conquest inherently grants divine ownership over the defeated populations and their resources. The architect of the continent's destruction abandons his tedious legal studies at Salamanca, utterly despising the agonizingly slow pace of bureaucratic advancement. His blinding sociopathic ambition demands immediate, massive wealth and unquestioned aristocratic status. In 1504, he crosses the deadly Atlantic Ocean, completely rejecting any intention of cultivating land. He explicitly declares he came to acquire solid gold, not to till the dirt like a common peasant. The brutal, systematic subjugation of Hispaniola and Cuba serves as his primary training ground in mass exploitation. He actively participates in the violent pacification campaigns, closely observing the immediate extermination of the native Taino populations through forced labor, starvation, and execution. He masters the twisted, hypocritical legal framework of Spanish imperialism. He learns exactly how to legally document horrific massacres as necessary pacifications. He discovers how to establish unauthorized, rogue town councils to legally bypass the direct authority of his immediate superiors. The encomienda system teaches him the core mechanics of institutionalized slavery, rewarding extreme military violence with massive grants of stolen land and hundreds of disposable human slaves. He thoroughly internalizes one absolute, undeniable reality regarding the Spanish monarchy. The distant royal court readily forgives any act of blatant treason, ignores any scale of human atrocity, and pardons any egregious violation of military protocol, provided the royal fifth, exactly 20% of all looted treasure, arrives securely in the royal treasury. This twisted incentive structure completely removes all moral restraints. The toxic combination of unchecked personal ambition, deeply ingrained religious supremacy, and calculated legal manipulation forges a highly intelligent, completely ruthless operator. He views entire civilizations, foreign cultures, and human lives strictly as expendable, temporary fuel designed solely to propel his own relentless upward mobility. The psychological foundation of the impending genocide solidifies entirely within this brutal, highly legalistic framework of sanctioned exploitation. He perfectly understands that extreme violence backed by legal documentation and massive wealth generation completely shields the perpetrator from any earthly consequences. In March 1519, the expedition forces violently storm the marshy coastlines of Tabasco, immediately confronting thousands of gathered Contal Maya warriors. The ensuing clash at Centla marks the horrific introduction of mechanized European slaughter to the mainland. The invading commander unleashes heavily armored cavalry charges directly into the densely packed indigenous infantry lines. The native defenders have never witnessed horses in the history of their civilization. They operate under the terrifying belief that the armored rider and the massive warhorse constitute a single, supernatural predatory beast. The psychological shock completely paralyses the defensive formations. Giant mastiffs, specifically bred and starved for combat, are released to rip out the throats of fleeing warriors. Spanish infantrymen deploy heavy Toledo steel swords that effortlessly slice through thick cotton armor, severing limbs and decapitating opponents with singular, fluid strikes. Artillery batteries unleash concentrated grapeshot, tearing massive, bloody holes directly through the terrified ranks. The utter asymmetry of the violence shatters the indigenous resistance within hours. The victorious commander demands immediate absolute submission and massive tributes. The defeated caciques surrender 20 enslaved women as offerings to the ruthless conquerors. Among these captives stands a highly educated, multilingual noblewoman who intimately understands the complex political geography of the continent. She immediately becomes the commander's most devastating asset, far deadlier than any cannon or cavalry charge. Through her immediate, precise translations, the commander gains deep psychological access into the hidden vulnerabilities of the massive, dominant Aztec Empire to the west. He explicitly learns that the vast Mesoamerican landscape is not a unified, monolithic state. It is a highly fractured, deeply resentful collection of brutalized tributary provinces actively bleeding under the crushing taxation and constant human sacrificial demands of the Aztec capital. The commander completely shifts his fundamental strategy. He transitions instantly from a simple, violent plunderer into a highly sophisticated psychological manipulator. He actively realizes he does not need to defeat an empire of millions with merely 500 exhausted soldiers. He only needs to systematically weaponize the existing, boiling hatred of the subjugated tribes. He deliberately positions himself as a divine liberator, manipulating local leaders with calculated displays of overwhelming force and false promises of total autonomy. He fully understands that absolute destruction requires internal collapse. He plans to use the bodies of the oppressed natives as his primary siege weapons against their own supreme rulers. The captive translator enables him to exploit every local grievance, intercept every political rumor, and turn every localized hatred into a concentrated, devastating weapon of mass destruction aimed directly at the heart of Tenochtitlan. The sheer, paralyzing scale of the Aztec Empire heavily crushes the morale of the invading force. The expeditionary soldiers fully realize they stand totally isolated on a massive, hostile continent, heavily outnumbered by hundreds of thousands of battle-hardened indigenous warriors. By July 1519, deep paranoia and outright mutiny rapidly infect the Spanish encampment at Veracruz. The terrified troops actively conspire to seize the anchored fleet, desperately plotting to sail back to the secure harbors of Cuba. The commander ruthlessly intercepts the conspiracy. He executes the primary ringleaders, hanging them from the ship masts, and ruthlessly orders the immediate amputation of the pilot's feet. However, extreme punitive violence is entirely insufficient to permanently cure the paralyzing terror gripping his exhausted men. The commander executes a masterstroke of psychological extremity. Under the absolute cover of darkness, he orders his most loyal operatives to systematically strip the heavy rigging, iron anchors, and massive sails from the entire fleet. They deliberately bore massive holes directly into the heavy wooden hulls of the galleons. The ships rapidly sink into the shallow, dark waters of the Gulf. He publicly blames the destruction on fictitious woodworms, presenting the catastrophic loss of the fleet as an unfortunate, unavoidable natural disaster. He actively severs the singular physical link to the European world. He intentionally traps 500 terrified men entirely behind enemy lines, facing an empire that regularly sacrifices thousands of prisoners on blood-soaked stone altars. The psychological calculation is absolutely terrifying. He deliberately guarantees that every single soldier understands that failure, retreat, or hesitation translates directly into having their beating hearts physically ripped from their living chests by obsidian blades. He entirely removes the psychological comfort of retreat. He fundamentally transforms their paralyzing, pathetic fear into concentrated, desperate, homicidal aggression. The soldiers possess absolutely no choice but to ruthlessly slaughter their way forward. The commander aggressively weaponizes the survival instinct of his own troops, forcing them into a brutal, binary reality: conquer or face an unimaginably agonizing death. This explicit act completely exposes the total depths of his sociopathy. He fully demonstrates his absolute willingness to actively risk the horrific slaughter of every single man under his direct command solely to achieve his maniacal personal ambitions. He does not lead his men, he psychologically holds them entirely hostage. The destruction of the fleet binds the fates of the terrified soldiers directly to the violent obsession of their commander, permanently sealing the horrific fate of the millions of indigenous people standing directly in their path. In May 1521, the protracted siege of the magnificent island capital initiates an unprecedented scale of apocalyptic urban horror. The invading forces systematically cut the heavy stone aqueducts, instantly denying fresh drinking water to hundreds of thousands of trapped civilians. They rigidly blockade the vital earthen causeways, absolutely choking off all agricultural supply lines. The highly concentrated population rapidly exhausts every available food source. Desperate, starving citizens strip the bark from the remaining trees, violently consuming muddy roots and heavily contaminated lake water. However, the ultimate weapon of mass destruction is completely invisible. The smallpox virus, brought entirely by the European invaders, detonates within the densely packed urban environment. The highly contagious pathogen rapidly covers the indigenous population in agonizing, festering pustules. The stricken victims physically cannot move from their sleeping mats to find water or food. Whole families simultaneously rot alive inside their enclosed stone dwellings, suffocating in the heavy stench of their own decaying flesh. The overwhelming death toll instantly collapses the city's sophisticated sanitation systems. Tens of thousands of rotting corpses deeply clog the intricate network of water canals. Giant swarms of flies permanently darken the sky, and massive packs of feral dogs feed endlessly on the unburied dead. The commander aggressively exploits this horrific biological devastation. He strictly orders his artillery batteries to continuously bombard the heavily populated residential sectors, indiscriminately pulverizing the fragile brick homes and shattering the massive stone temples. His heavy brigantines patrol the surrounding lake, relentlessly firing heavy iron cannons into the tightly packed wooden canoes attempting to flee the suffocating nightmare. The Spanish infantry painstakingly advances block by bloody block. They forcefully level every single captured building, systematically throwing the heavy structural debris directly into the canals to physically build a solid path for the advancing heavy cavalry. They completely erase the entire architectural layout of the floating metropolis. The psychological agony of the defending warriors aggressively peaks as they watch their glorious, sacred capital deliberately physically dismantled stone by heavily carved stone, transformed permanently into a massive, heavily infected graveyard. The deeply cynical commander exhibits zero hesitation or recognizable human mercy. He strictly views the immense, catastrophic civilian suffering purely as a highly effective tactical advantage. The absolute destruction of Tenochtitlan is not an unfortunate byproduct of war, it is a highly intentional, meticulously executed campaign of total urban extermination specifically designed to violently break the psychological spine of the entire massive civilization. Every collapsed roof and heavily poisoned well serves his absolute purpose. The psychological dismantling of the supreme Aztec ruler represents a masterclass in highly concentrated political manipulation. In November 1519, the invading commander audaciously walks directly into the heavily guarded royal palace and aggressively executes an unprecedented hostage operation. He permanently confines the previously untouchable Emperor Moctezuma entirely within his own opulent residential quarters, heavily surrounded by armored Spanish guards keeping their hands permanently resting on their sword hilts. The commander fundamentally avoids executing the powerful monarch. He thoroughly understands that a dead martyr instantly triggers a massive, uncontrollable urban uprising. Instead, he systematically hollows out the immense psychological authority of the sovereign. He completely transforms the revered god-king into a highly compliant, terrified political puppet. He aggressively forces the captive ruler to continue conducting his daily administrative rituals, continuously issuing official decrees and directly collecting massive tributary taxes from the surrounding provinces. However, every single royal command is strictly dictated by the heavily armed European parasite firmly attached to the throne. The commander ruthlessly forces the captive emperor to publicly surrender the immense royal treasuries, continuously smelting intricately crafted golden religious artifacts into crude, easily transportable metal bars. The psychological humiliation is absolute and meticulously orchestrated. The commander forces the deeply religious monarch to passively watch as Catholic crosses are violently hammered directly into the highest platforms of the sacred central pyramids. He strictly forces the emperor to physically prevent his own elite generals from violently retaliating against the arrogant, outnumbered invaders. The immense, heavily armed indigenous population remains completely paralyzed, hopelessly trapped between their deeply ingrained religious devotion to their divine leader and the overwhelming, undeniable reality of his pathetic captivity. The commander aggressively weaponizes this precise paralysis. He continually exploits the deeply established Aztec societal hierarchy, effectively using the unquestionable authority of the supreme ruler to forcefully pacify the seething anger of the millions of citizens. This extremely delicate, highly volatile psychological hostage situation successfully prevents an immediate massacre of the vastly outnumbered Spanish garrison for several agonizing months. The commander violently steals the central nervous system of the entire empire, effectively paralyzing the massive military apparatus by maintaining direct physical control over the supreme brain. The horrific reality of a powerful, terrifying empire completely subdued from the inside out firmly establishes the commander as a genuinely terrifying psychological predator. He does not physically break the massive stone walls of the palace, he systematically shatters the fundamental mental pillars of the entire sophisticated civilization. In May 1520, the calculated illusion of peaceful coexistence violently shatters during the sacred, highly anticipated festival of Toxcatl. The primary commander temporarily departs the tense capital, explicitly leaving his most vicious, deeply unstable lieutenant entirely in charge of the heavily fortified garrison. This subordinate officer entirely lacks the sophisticated psychological restraint and calculating patience of his superior. Deeply consumed by intense paranoia and fiercely triggered by the overwhelming, rhythmic drumming and massive gatherings of the indigenous nobility, he initiates an act of unfathomable, unprovoked butchery. Thousands of unarmed Aztec elites, adorned exclusively in fragile ceremonial feathers and heavy golden jewelry, pack tightly into the massive central courtyard to perform their traditional religious dances. The nervous Spanish troops completely seal the massive exits. Without any distinct provocation or warning, the heavily armored infantry explicitly charges directly into the densely packed, unarmed dancers. They aggressively slash heavy swords through exposed human torsos, violently severing heads and amputating limbs completely mid-step. The heavily armed soldiers explicitly target the most prominent tribal leaders, violently tearing heavy gold pendants directly from the bleeding necks of the dying victims. The highly aggressive slaughter instantly transforms the sacred ceremonial space into a massive, inescapable slaughterhouse. The thick blood rapidly pools so deep the heavily armored Spaniards physically slip on the smooth stone tiles while continuously butchering the screaming survivors. Unlike the primary commander's coldly calculated, explicitly strategic executions, this massacre is driven entirely by pure, unhinged terror and overwhelming, unrestrained greed. This specific incident represents the absolute breaking point for the deeply subjugated urban population. The brutalized citizens instantly recognize that total compliance directly guarantees their immediate, unprovoked execution. The heavy psychological chains binding the immense city finally snap. The enraged, massive population violently swarms the fortified Spanish quarters, launching an unrelenting, deeply organized counteroffensive. In June 1520, the sheer, unrelenting desperation peaks during the horrifying midnight retreat strictly documented as the Night of Sorrows. The heavily trapped Spanish garrison inherently realizes that remaining enclosed within the deeply enraged city heavily guarantees total, brutal extermination. Under the absolute cover of heavy rainfall, the terrified, exhausted soldiers desperately attempt to silently traverse the massive earthen causeways stretching across the pitch-black lake. However, their deeply fatal flaw is an absolute, unshakable obsession with stolen wealth. Instead of strictly prioritizing rapid mobility, hundreds of soldiers aggressively strap massive, solid gold bars directly to their heavily armored bodies. They forcefully stagger forward, fundamentally paralyzed by the extreme weight of their looted treasure. The defensive native sentries immediately detect the noisy, slow-moving column. Instantly, massive, deafening war drums echo aggressively across the dark, rising water. Thousands of stealthy wooden canoes aggressively swarm the narrow, highly vulnerable causeway. The indigenous warriors deeply shatter the fragile wooden bridges linking the causeway segments, deliberately opening massive, gaping chasms directly into the deep, heavily armored waters below. Absolute, unrestrained chaos instantly erupts. Heavily armored horses forcefully slip on the blood-slicked stone edges, violently plunging their screaming riders directly into the freezing depths. Panicked, deeply terrified soldiers violently shove their own heavily encumbered comrades entirely over the sheer edges, desperately fighting to cross the violently expanding gaps. The sheer, unfathomable weight of the stolen gold acts as a deadly, inescapable anchor. Hundreds of Spanish infantrymen violently sink straight to the muddy bottom of the deep lake, physically unable to unbuckle their heavy armor or voluntarily release the heavy treasure actively dragging them down to a suffocating death. The pursuing indigenous warriors continuously drag struggling, heavily wounded Spaniards directly into the swarming canoes, strictly securing them alive for imminent temple sacrifice. The massive gap within the causeway gradually fills entirely with the rotting, deeply submerged corpses of men and heavily armored horses. The surviving soldiers literally physically trample directly over the submerged, lifeless bodies of their own brutally drowned comrades just to reach the opposite shore. The deeply traumatized commander openly weeps upon surveying the heavily decimated remnants of his completely shattered forces. The heavy greed he meticulously cultivated within his own men becomes their direct executioner. The psychological terror completely solidifies. The absolute wealth they aggressively murdered entire populations to violently acquire ultimately serve specifically to violently drown them in the freezing darkness of the muddy lake. In February 1525, the sheer paranoia of maintaining absolute power completely consumes the deeply obsessed conqueror. He obsessively perceives active treason strictly everywhere. He forcibly drags the final, heavily chained Aztec Emperor, Cuauhtémoc, deeply into the suffocating, malaria-infested jungles of Honduras on a highly disastrous, completely unnecessary expedition. The densely impenetrable wilderness violently strips away all the technological advantages of the European invaders. The heavy armor heavily rusts, the exhausted horses starve, and the deeply weakened men aggressively resort to boiling their thick leather belts simply to survive the agonizing hunger. Deeply isolated from the massive resources of his newly conquered capital, the deeply paranoid commander becomes entirely convinced the captive emperor is actively orchestrating a massive, highly coordinated uprising within the heavy jungle canopy. Without holding any formal trial or possessing a single shred of actual evidence, he strictly orders the immediate execution of the captive monarch. He violently hangs the sovereign ruler directly from the high branches of a massive ceiba tree. This highly unprovoked murder deeply horrifies even his most loyal, battle-hardened veterans. It completely strips away the final remaining shreds of the commander's heavily manufactured image as a legitimate royal authority. The agonizing march severely physically breaks the commander, returning him to the capital severely emaciated and deeply stripped of his previous aura of complete invincibility. Upon his eventual return, he directly discovers his absolute power has been systematically usurped. The deeply suspicious Spanish crown strictly refuses to heavily trust a heavily independent warlord commanding a massive private army. They aggressively dispatch calculating royal auditors to strictly investigate his extensive financial abuses and permanently strip away his heavily centralized political authority. He rapidly transitions from an absolute dictator into a heavily marginalized, deeply frustrated petitioner continuously begging the royal court for acknowledgement. He is heavily mired in endless, deeply exhausting legal disputes, constantly defending himself against highly severe accusations of massive embezzlement and treason. The heavy bureaucratic machinery of the Spanish Empire successfully achieves exactly what millions of indigenous warriors actively could not. It fundamentally neutralizes his extreme power. The highly ruthless predator is systematically reduced to a highly paranoid, deeply litigious shadow, hopelessly trapped within the slow, suffocating confines of the imperial legal system. His violent downfall is entirely administrative, a deeply humiliating end for a deeply violent man entirely defined by his highly absolute, aggressive conquest. In December 1547, the architect of the massive destruction eventually expires deeply buried in heavily debt-ridden obscurity within the rigid confines of Spain. He physically passes away completely ignored by the absolute royal authority he aggressively slaughtered millions of people to impress. He possesses immense geographical wealth solely on heavy legal parchment, yet he strictly lacks the actual physical funds simply to return directly to the continent he violently conquered. He leaves behind an utterly unfathomable geographical graveyard. The destruction of the indigenous civilization represents one of the absolutely most rapid, deeply devastating demographic collapses completely recorded within human history. Entire complex populations are violently erased completely from existence within a single brutal generation. The brutal psychological framework explicitly established during the massive, unprovoked conquest permanently hardwires absolute systemic physical exploitation directly into the foundation of the continent. The devastating combination of unrelenting biological warfare heavily masked by extreme religious fanaticism efficiently achieves total regional annihilation. He fundamentally proved that pure, unrelenting sociopathy successfully conquers everything. He never exhibits a single recorded instance of psychological remorse for the unprecedented scale of human suffering he intentionally directly inflicted. He continuously thoroughly justifies every single massacre, every forced execution, and every completely shattered city strictly as a highly necessary, holy requirement for his personal elevation. The true absolute horror lies strictly in the undeniable reality that his terrifying psychological methods were wildly successful. He entirely achieved his twisted personal objectives through the strictly calculated application of massive, paralyzing terror. He permanently violently rewrote the demographic map of the entire planet using only raw, unhinged violence. The massive indigenous population inhabiting the vast central region explicitly numbered roughly 25 million people prior to his immediate brutal arrival. Exactly 100 agonizing years following his violent invasion, the completely decimated surviving indigenous population drops directly to a terrifying 1 million people. If you have the stomach to continue facing the most brutal, blood-soaked corners of humanity, hit like, subscribe, and leave a comment on which monster we should dissect next. History is never a fairy tale, it is always written in blood.